Great. I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off because we have a full discussion for this morning in just an hour. So good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to GCIR's program, Standing Together. We just go back one slide. There we go. Thank you. So welcome to GCIR's program, Philanthropy's COVID-19 Relief Funds and Immigrant Communities. My name is Kevin Douglas, and I'm Director of National Programs here at GCIR. And I wanted to just quickly say a word about today's program before we move into some of the logistics. So the conversation that we organized this morning is really grounded in, and if I could actually just ask folks to mute yourself, we're getting a little bit of background noise. But the program that we arranged this morning was really, probably like theoretically over a year in the making. Not because we've been working on this program specifically for a year, but because we've been deeply involved in responding to and working with Philanthropy to respond to the pandemic since early last year. And then here in California, GCIR helped set up the nation's first public-private partnership to provide support to undocumented community members who were left out of the Federal CARES Act, as well as ineligible for unemployment insurance. And through that experience working with lots of grantees across the state of California and providing some technical assistance to other funders throughout the country, it became clear to us there were a lot of lessons to be learned from the process of setting up funds and some knowledge that was important to memorialize and pull into future crises. And we were really fortunate to have the support of Open Society Foundation to go about conducting that research and compiling a report, which we'll share with you this morning, that really pulls together some of those findings and lessons, so we're in a good position the next time a crisis rolls around and philanthropy is called on to respond. For today's program, we have three speakers, or actually four speakers, who will be talking a little bit from both the research perspective that went into connecting with hundreds of groups across the country to understand a little bit some of the top level learnings. We'll hear from one of the administrators of a fund, and we'll also hear from a grant maker that supported a fund. And then we'll have some time for question and answer and discussion toward the end. So with that, I will move us to logistics and just share a couple of housekeeping notes. The first is that today's webinar is going to be recorded and will be made available afterwards. The second is that we do have a chat feature here where you'll be able to drop in questions as we go along. Our moderator and I will keep an eye on those, and we'll try to make sure to get to them through the discussion or in the Q&A period. I think most folks have already done this, but if not, just please keep your lines muted to avoid that background noise and to maximize our audio bandwidth. And then finally, just a reminder, you can go to the upper portion of the screen and select speaker view if you really want to zoom in on the person presenting at that time. So move to the next slide. I also wanted to give recognition to a couple of the co-sponsors who helped us promote and share this program, Grantmakers in Health, Grantmakers Council Rhode Island, and Philanthropy Northwest. We really appreciate the partnership of these philanthropic organizations to help spread the word to as wide a constituency as possible on this important topic. And then finally, I wanted to also express appreciation to our members at GCIR who really support and help make this work possible. You can see a little bit more about what that looks like on this slide here. And with that, I'm going to turn us over to our moderator. And just a quick reminder, again, I see a couple of lines are still unmuted. If you could mute those to prevent the background noise from coming through. And so I'm really glad to be able to introduce our moderator for this morning, Lainey Romero-Alston. You have her full bio up here. I'll just give us the first part of it, which is that her work focuses on building a vibrant movement and promoting effective policies that ensure the rights and protections of vulnerable workers in the global economy, including migrant workers, with a particular focus in the United States, Mexico, and Central America. I couldn't even fit her full bio on the screen. She's accomplished a lot in her career and has been a long time supporter and champion and ally to GCIR. So we're really grateful to have her support for this program, to have her support for conducting the research that we're able to do. And I'm really excited for today's dialogue. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Lainey. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and I appreciate that. And I'm just thrilled to be here. If you need to shout out to me, you can just call me by my short name, which is 711, according to Ring Central. And yeah, and I just really encourage folks to not necessarily chat out at 711, but to sort of engage in the conversation as we go using your chat. Using the chat mechanism that we know so well after a year and a half in this pandemic. And before I dig in, I do really want to appreciate your leadership, particularly Kevin, in this effort, in this project, in the partnership with GCIR that has been both, a leader for not just in the context of the pandemic, but really for, for a decade or so, and stepping up and responding to the moment and meeting the needs of immigrant communities who particularly find themselves in sort of at the fault lines and at the front lines of crisis, but doing so in a way that helps us to organize, to advocate on behalf of systems change, and to be ready and better in what we do in the next time around. And I think that's sort of the gist of this conversation. Just a few things to frame up. OSF, Open Society Foundations, where I work, is generally not a direct relief organization. But when COVID hit, and just the scale at which it hit, not only here in the U.S. but obviously globally, our president at the time, Patrick Gaspard, felt very strongly that we actually, yes, continue to work around policy and systems change, but we had to do something that responded to the felt needs and the incredible crisis that people were feeling in the moment, that only sort of working at high level policy without addressing the actual sort of felt needs was tone deaf. And so we committed even sort of only in the U.S. around this cash assistance program, $36 million towards seeding locally led solutions that both affirmed both the role of government, and indeed we felt pretty strongly that the exclusion of millions of workers, and particularly immigrant and undocumented workers, was a failure of our existing social safety net that needed to be fixed. But in the meantime, we needed to close that. We needed to sort of put the finger in the dike, but do that in a way that affirmed the role of governments, and particularly local governments, mayors, immigrant affairs offices in cities, counties. We worked very closely with Judge Lina Hidalgo, and Ginny is on the call today, and states who are really closest to the ground to respond, but also doing that in relationship to community organizations, and particularly immigrant and vulnerable worker organizations who also have the expertise, the knowledge, and need to be part of the solutions, both to the immediate and in the long term. So our response in that 36 million, yes, was distributing cash to people quickly and agilely and as effectively to reach the population we needed, but doing that in a way that also was leaving infrastructure behind, was strengthening our knowledge and our tools and our approaches and the infrastructure we needed for the next time. And that was linking relief to advocacy and systems change. For this reason, in addition to the 30 cities, counties, and states we worked with directly, we also supported immigrant worker organizations. We worked very closely with the National Domestic Workers Alliance that retooled their Corona Cares Fund to be able to work much broader beyond domestic workers, with the National Immigrant Law Center, and with GCIR and many others. We also worked with a number who are actually on this call of other philanthropies to come together to support other types of direct relief programs through the Families and Workers Fund, which is just a little sneak peek into the report, is predominantly is uplifted as an important model and approach. So listen, we had a lot of practice and experience from Katrina, from Sandy, from Maria, from the wildfires, but this was the largest locally led public-private response ever on steroids, and we learned a lot. And the sort of need to really take stock and build from this, so we are more ready to continue to respond to the needs that are ongoing. The pandemic is not over, the economic crisis not over, but to be able to flip the switch more quickly when Ida hit, which it did, and when the wildfires continue, but also to be at the ready for the opportunities where national and local entities need to respond to reach the communities we care about, like the child tax credit that frankly is having a hard time reaching the populations we care about, or as when Congress does pass this infrastructure bill, the billions of dollars that will come down to city and state levels, and how do we really activate these types of partnerships, these types of tools, et cetera, to make sure that those resources actually respond both to the pain points, but move to the systems we need for the long term. So that is the point of this conversation. Luckily, and I feel really proud to have partnered with GCIR to document some of this and give us some of the insights, particularly with the research that two of our speakers, Alice Cottingham of Alice Cottingham and Associates, and Althea Gonzalez, who is a project consultant that worked with in GCIR, did, who will kick us off for this conversation and sharing the results of their research. And then we will go to Dr. Eric Eddy, Eric, I hope I am, Dr. Eddy, I hope I am pronouncing your name right, who is the President Chief Operating Officer of AFRICOM, who is one of the community-based organizations that was really core to designing and implementing a cash assistance program in Philadelphia, and a longtime friend and incredible champion of philanthropy, Sharon Bush, who's the president of the Grand Victoria Foundation, that not a surprise, aside from California, where GCIR was core to leading one of the largest state level responses at the time until New York State passed its $2.1 billion fund. Illinois was also right there in being bold in terms of the response to this. So I'm going to now move to Althea and Alice to lay out their research and the findings. Again, I do want to encourage folks to put their questions and comments in the chat, and I'll try to weave them throughout as we go. So Alice and Althea, on to you.
Thank you so much, Lainey. It's a pleasure for Alice and I to be here, and we're excited to present a little bit of what was learned in the report. And thanks to the hundreds of people that we got to hear from across the country. The first slide that has the map, please, Ruby or Angelica, to give a little bit of a background is, for this research, we did a ton of online looking around for funds and found that there were hundreds and hundreds of funds across the country. So with GCIR, we narrowed it down to choose 26 states that had a diverse configuration, whether it was regionally, how long their immigrant population had been there, the size of their immigrant population, the political context. And from these 26 states, we found over 550 funds, and we reached out to all of those and received responses from 113 of them. So our research is based on the surveys and interviews of those folks, and we're grateful to them to have spent time with us. These funds were led by nonprofits. They were led by community groups who are not nonprofits, foundations, state and local governments, and multiple combinations of all of those participated in funds. So it looked like many different configurations across the country. But this is the framing for the findings that we're going to share with you. And at the next slide, just give you a high level about the findings. There are three main categories of findings in this report. The first is which ones were kind of consistently effective philanthropic practices. And we'll share a few examples of each of those. The second is about what viable options, because sometimes funds, that's all right, back it up if you would. We'll get to that in a second, what the viable options were, because sometimes funds had to pivot in different ways depending on their local context and the players available. And the last set of findings were some interesting dilemmas that we discovered. So we're going to share with you one or two examples or topics under each of those findings. Alice, will you take it over, please?
Sure. And good morning, Althea, my partner in research. So consistently effective practices are ones that are findings that we identified that were used by many different crisis funds and that were consistently worked out well for those who use them. And the couple of examples that I'd like to talk about are, one is about philanthropy flexing its inherent power. And the second one will be about relying on community-based organizations that have relationships with undocumented people and are credible in their communities. So unlike some of us during the pandemic who stopped working our muscles in significant ways, it's clear that philanthropy itself actually worked hard to use that inherent power in its work. We've heard many of the recommendations for what that practice should look like from GEO and from Project Streamline over the years. But what we've seen during the pandemic is that many funders, both grant makers and local and state governments, stepped up to do grant making in ways that were designed to meet two primary goals. One was to get money out quickly to people who needed it, and the other was to keep the burden on the community-based organizations who often were delivering that money as light as possible, recognizing that the pandemic was not just affecting community members, but affecting community organizations. Some of the practices that I'm referring to included philanthropy taking a much more rapid approach to strategy development than has often been the case, a much greater emphasis on providing general operating support that was quite flexible. Much more frequently, foundations trusted the organizations that they were funding to distribute money, to make decisions about who exactly would be eligible for those funds and how eligibility would be assessed and how funds would be delivered. That is, funders really trusted their grant partners in ways that have not traditionally been so common. Some foundations increased their annual payout, either from the 5% minimum, or if they were already above that, they bumped up what they were giving out. Many grant makers told us that they reduced their reporting requirements, either eliminating them in some cases or making the reports much briefer and much less frequent. All of these changes were very much appreciated by the organizations that received money, I think for obvious reasons. What we note about these changes is that in a crisis, philanthropy can use methods that are not typical and can define those unusual methods as successful. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about under consistently effective practices is that while funders, again, both local and state governments and foundations and other parts of philanthropy, used a lot of approaches to how to get money out, an approach that was singularly often chosen by those funders was to make grants directly to community-based organizations who had relationships with undocumented people in their community and who were really seen as credible by members of that community. Those are qualifications, of course, that define the best of what an immigrant justice organization is. And over the last several decades, we've seen a lot of funders back those organizations in a very intentional way. And that backing really bore fruit in this crisis. Could I have the next slide, please? So the second category of findings is this viable option. And a viable option, examples of findings here are those where more than one approach worked really effectively. So grant makers have some choices. And specifically, the one I'd like to just mention that was a viable option is we asked the groups that we surveyed to tell us how they defined eligibility for the funding that they made available. And there were three consistent ways that funders responded. They responded along a continuum of a narrow focus to a very broad focus. So the narrow was specifically to undocumented people and their families, a group of people who were deliberately excluded from the CARES Act. And then on the other end of the continuum were people who had been affected by the pandemic. And we had significant representation from survey respondents who had used all three of the categories. The middle one, by the way, is people who were excluded from the CARES Act. So undocumented people, adults who do not live independently, and a few other categories. It was very clear to us that all of those eligibility categories work to get dollars to undocumented people. Funders chose different eligibility categories in order to address local realities. For instance, in Georgia, where being undocumented is really quite unsafe, local funders decided to frame their giving as for people who've been badly affected by the pandemic, rather than to undocumented people, for fear that they would bring undue attention to them. And you can see in the quote on this slide that this was true in another state as well, in a government official's assessment of how to define eligibility. So again, funders can address a number of political, local, internal cultural preferences about how far they go in defining whether they're funding undocumented immigrants in various ways. I'll hand it back to you, Althea.
Thanks, Alice. And the next slide, just say a little bit about the dilemmas. And the piece about the dilemmas is there were some curious findings, some takeaways from the respondents' comments that are not easily resolved. It's not like a clear, funders should clearly do this, but it's going to be an opportunity for grant makers to consider how they might be addressed, and certainly in partnership with some of the organizations or their local constituents. And so, for instance, one of the dilemmas, and Lainey already pointed this out, is the fact that even though the crisis is continuing, funders seem to be turning away or have ended their response. And so part of the question is, how long do you stick with relief funding? How do you plan long enough into where we think recovery might be so that you're still in the game? And if you are needing to exit, how can you be transparent with your grantees so that they actually have a plan for how to continue the work or find other resources? So that's part one. We had about 40% of the funders that we surveyed were still providing some form of direct pandemic relief in April, May of this year. But that means a whole bunch had already stopped funding. So how do we stay in the game for the long haul? And the second piece is that one might think, wow, doing this work either really helped foundations or really helped organizations or really hurt them. And we found both to be the case. For some organizations, doing cash relief brought new skills, new technological advances, new relationships with funding partners or community collaborators. And on the other side, some found that it really burnt out their staff. If they didn't get any funding for general operating or the cost of delivering support, then they ended up taking it out of their own funds, and that really reduce their capacity organizationally. So thinking about the both and of that it strained and strengthened, and how can funders be in conversation with their grantees about what they really need so that we don't reduce capacity by pivoting to this. And then in the last slide, we'll say just a little bit about these recommendations. Alice and I really sought to answer a few questions, and one of them was, how can philanthropy respond to crises? And certainly there's information about that. And what does philanthropy need to do in the downtime when we are between crises? And overall, also a question about, how do we keep deepening equity, our equity work in grant making and advocacy work, while we're doing this direct grant making for relief? And so our recommendations are threefold, and we'll go into them a little bit more, I'm sure, in the discussion time. And I bet that Dr. Edie and Sharon will also echo some of these pieces, that whatever the grant making advances that we've done, making it easier on grantees and moving money out more quickly, that hopefully some of those crisis funding habits become new norms. That in downtime, it's really important to keep building the infrastructure of organizations and of the sector that we are involved with, to make sure that they're available and ready to pivot in times of crises. And then most importantly, how do we combine cash aid funding with advocacy to change the policy so that we have government-sized solutions for these problems rather than just philanthropy size? And with that, I'll turn it back over to Lainey.
Thanks so much, Althea and Alice, and for the work you've done. And I'm sure that we've just had a mad rush on that link that Kevin put in the chat. But folks, please do check out the report and share it. And hopefully we can build on these conversations as we build these muscles moving forward. So, Dr. Edie, I would like to turn to you as one of the community leaders and experts as the president and CEO of AFRICOM. If you can maybe just very briefly give us a quick recap of sort of what you all did in Philadelphia and how. But what I'd like to really ask you is if you can respond to what Althea and Alice sort of really put out there at the end towards what for us, particularly in philanthropy now? What do we need to be readying? What do we need to be preparing? What do we need to be doing moving forward to support the work that you have built and I'm sure continuing?
Thank you so much. And I am happy to be part of this conversation. And I will say I'm very humble. Out of all these community-based organizations that have done and did their best to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, helping families to alleviate the economic, social, cultural impact, even the vaccine equity, for AFRICOM to be invited to speak is a wonderful thing. So I want to thank you, Althea and Alice, for that. And thank you for making us also part of this report with one of the group that you interviewed. I think before I shared what you said, I want to address what's the questions at the end of the presentation that we heard. Based on the experience that I have, I think that funders should be number one, mindful of staff wellness at these community-based organizations. Number one is that, and here the reason I say, at AFRICOM, when the pandemic hit, it was very serious. Me personally, as the chief operating officer, I did not measure at first how heavy and how impactful it will be on the even small staff that we have. And we are looking. So we were not very, and I was not, were very intentional about, how the fund that, we'll receive can also be geared toward, taking care of the staff who will be called to meet with families and deliver X, Y, and Z to them. So that's the number one thing we want to be mindful of. The second thing that has been very helpful is again how, for instance, with the Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizenship Coalition, the model has been that community-based organization or immigrant-led organization decided on the utilization of the fund for the cash assistance. For instance, when we decided to set aside a pot of money for the undocumented people, is because we have a prior work serving those undocumented immigrants as well. And I believe that that decision was great in the sense that, where it gave us, much leverage on really what we need to do to reach out to communities. So that's another avenue to consider, the community-based or community participatory, grant making, involving a lot more of these community-based organizations in the decision making will be great. Another thing that I heard, and I will relate to that, is the amount of reporting. I have been one of the strongest advocates to organizations or funders to reduce the reporting, right, compared to maybe the information that they need, because certain grassroots organizations do not have the capacity to sit down for 2 hours to write the grants. Yet, that does not match with the work that they are able to do on the ground. So we have a call for that, to be taken into consideration as well. And I believe that these are some of the things that I want to share here to answer the question about, what might be done in the future. Another thing also is very quickly, we have seen that, during the pandemic, funders, and thank you, all have really increased their concern or their portfolio, if you want, the budget for what we call, a Black immigrant-led, fund. One of the questions is, hey, is it a pandemic issue? Is it something that is going to be sustained beyond the pandemic, which we wish, what can be behind us? This is another thing that you want to reassure those community-based organizations, immigrant-led as well, regarding that. Last point is, of course, those grants, were very geared toward, were alleviating the impact or the burden of the pandemic. But at the same time, it was great for me, particularly, and for AFRICOM, that most of these grants came in as a general operating, right? It gave us, really the flexibility and the leverage to do that. Now, very quickly about, what we did. COVID-19 was, for everybody, a very challenging, or is and continue to be a very challenging phenomenon. But for small immigrant-led organization, it was like, okay, we are closing doors now. We are not capable of doing that. The first thing is this remote work. We were not prepared for that. Meaning that, some funders were very mindful and say, hey, what can we do for you to continue to do your work? So some technological grant money came in there. It is something that, what to keep in mind as well. So when we started receiving funds, it was, I will say, difficult because of the pandemic and the magnitudes of services that you have to deliver. But we had a little, built-in experience, because prior to COVID-19, AFRICOM was already delivering cash assistance program, but very, very, very small. We were giving, $50, food vouchers to senior citizens, or even to families that were really in need around the holidays period, for instance. We were also paying for utility bills for those who were facing immediate, electricity, gas, or water shut-off. And we were also helping with supplementing some rental, money here and there. But the budget was very small. But that experience was there. So with COVID coming in, one serious thing we have to decide was, who are we going to give the money to? Understanding that, the stimulus checks were coming in from the federal government for certain families, obviously, we put the priority on those who were excluded from all these packages in the beginning, right? Including the international students. including obviously, what the undocumented folks and low-income families. Some of them, do receive the stimulus checks, but what do you do with that when your shops, have closed down? You have 5 children in the home to feed, and you have to face all this. This is how we segmented and determined the priority. We did all that keeping one thing in mind. What do we do? Remember that, the pandemic happened right after the census. And during the census, we were facing a lot of, pushback from community members like, hey, is it our information that, what people will need? And the pandemic also came at the time when the Trump administration came up with a new public charge rule. So all these things were like, were the background against which we were operating. So whatever approach that, we had, we wanted to make sure that people did not feel like, we were getting some extra information from them that will put them in a very awkward situation because of the money that we receive. And I can share this little story with a group. The group, there is a young lady, a mother actually, who was referred to us. She told her friends that, I seriously need help. When I reached out to her, she came back and said, I just want to make sure that, we are not getting into trouble because we are hearing too many things about what can happen later. You see? So this kind of reassurance. So that's how we selected the people who will receive. Now, how did we distribute the money?
Dr. Eddie, I'm going to ask you just very quickly if there's one more thing in terms of from insights that you want to share, and then I'm going to move to Sharon so we can have some chance for folks.
I just want to talk very quickly about how we distributed the money. I think that's important. We use all kind of avenues, right? Those who had a bank account, we deliver checks. Those who did not have, we use those gift cards. Those who did, for rarely we gave, direct, cash into the hand because we have to be also accountable. But in any case, what we did, we opened up the process and operated in such a way that, we remove all kind of barriers that will prevent, us from reaching out the maximum of the people we wanted to do.
So thank you so much. There's so much richness there, and obviously, so you were getting a lot of, a lot of cheers in the chat for things you were hitting on in terms of the importance of flexibility. Both in terms of the type of money that is given, general operating support, but also reporting requirements. I know OSF really there was a slew of funders that moved towards flexibility, towards lifting reporting requirements during the pandemic, and why can't these things perhaps be extended beyond the importance of supporting organizations close to the ground, not only for implementation, but for shaping the solutions in a participatory form. And then I just really want to uplift what you said of the toll that this moment it took on both the people we are working to reach and serve, but also the organizations and the staff in the organizations. There was an article that really struck me in the Los Angeles Times, I think, that just talked about the toll of the pandemic on nonprofits that stepped in to play the role of ultimately a government safety net that was just really serious, and the flattening there, and the reality that so many of us, even the organizations, and you highlight this, Alice and Althea, in your report, didn't provide the infrastructure support for anywhere from 10 to 20% that we know is at a minimum true cost of doing business, to the detriment of long-term sustainability. So thank you, Dr. Eddy, for uplifting all of those really important points. I'm going to turn to you,
My
Sharon.
pleasure.
Now to really talk about, someone who's been in philanthropy for a while and has been making these connections for a long time, as long as I've known you, in multiple ways. I want to just give it to you in terms of both sort of what did this mean for you and your colleagues in Illinois as you were stepping up to sort of meet this moment, and how has that impacted the way in which you are doing your work within Grand Victoria Foundation, but also more broadly with your colleagues in philanthropy moving forward?
Thanks, Lainey. It's really great to be here. I like these opportunities to have a chance to listen too. So it was great to hear Dr. Eddy's comments and really to hear Allison Althea run through these recommendations. So I come here as the president of Grand Victoria Foundation, and we are based in Chicago, and we do our grant making throughout the state of Illinois. And we've been a traditional foundation in many ways, and in some ways of thinking progressively. And we're in the middle of thinking about what that means in the moment that we're in today. And I could talk a little bit more about that later. But I'm coming here today because I had the experience last summer of being a leader on the Illinois COVID Response Fund. Grand Victoria Foundation made a decision last year to really double down on providing relief and emergency response last year, and we did that in a number of ways. We made a big contribution to the Illinois COVID Response Fund, and I was actively a participant in the shaping the grant making there. We contributed to the Chicago COVID Relief Fund. We did one in a place that we have been funding for many years, which is Elgin, Illinois, which is about 30 to 40 miles northwest of the city. And then we also did our own emergency relief directly to grantees for these reasons that Eric describes, which are around just making sure people could be nimble to shift their operations in a time where they weren't prepared to go fully virtual. And even we weren't, even with all the resources that we had. Just a couple of highlights around things that were notable, just to this issue of around what it meant to do relief funding and response funding and be inclusive of immigrant communities. So I'll just try to focus and hone in there. But several reflections, I guess, on the Illinois work in particular. In Illinois, we really actually had really supportive leadership in the public sector. And that wasn't a recommendation necessarily or an observation. I don't know if that was an observation you guys report, Allison Althea, but that was a big part of the conditions here in Illinois. So we had a governor who said, hey, can we make this? How do we make this happen? The person who chaired the effort was his sister, right, which was the former Treasury Secretary. And that allowed us to bring funds together in a lightning fast way. We raised $30 million within a matter of weeks, which is to say that philanthropy can do what it wants when it wants. And so that's a big lesson that Alice and Althea are saying to us. And that was certainly true with this effort. We also have a secretary of our Department of Human Services who has direct experience working in immigrant communities, and her advocacy with all of these different opportunities to leverage relief funds and pair them with government funds that were coming down in the way that she saw them was huge. So without her mindset of already thinking about what the needs of immigrant communities were, particularly undocumented immigrants, and really her use from prior experiences of a racial equity lens was super helpful in thinking about how do we get some additional millions of dollars to those folks who were excluded from government funds. So that was really huge. She really leveraged her position with organized philanthropy to do that. I think one of the things, though, that was interesting is we were relying a lot on public system data to make decisions in real time around what was happening to folks on the ground. So that at that time, we were learning of the disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx families. But that data is, as we all know, there are shortcomings to public system data, particularly as it relates to undocumented immigrants. And we didn't have really good on the ground data that would drive those decisions from the outset around what we meant by vulnerable communities. So it took us a few rounds of funding to get there. I think that might relate to this other thing that I think Lainey talked about in her introduction, which is, how do we then think about what future advocacy could look like around some of the ways in which the money was distributed, which is cash assistance and the folks who have been advocating to do that in a systemic, structural way. And if we are able to do that and are inclusive of these other communities, what might the impact of that be on public system data to capture folks differently and better without there being perceived or real risk or threat to them sharing their information, because otherwise we will still be in kind of this cycle of how to do that. There was a blessing and a curse to using known networks for relief work, I would say. It's a blessing because we have incredible infrastructure in Illinois and we got to really flex that. So great network of community foundations and United Ways who partner to distribute the money and get it out really, really fast. But as we were collecting more data on who was most affected, that conversation actually began to be really different around how do we get to the grassroots organizations who are on the ground, who have been doing this kind of work, particularly in areas outside of the Chicago metropolitan region. That became a conversation. And so we did do work to fund directly to intermediary organizations like the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, which is referenced in their report, the Illinois Migrant Council, a group called FLAP, which is the Farm Worker and Landscapers Advocacy Project, which organizes those folks, the Latino Policy Forum, which really kind of stepped up and took on additional capacity that it didn't really have to actually get out cash assistance and really tried to do that. So there was infrastructure there and tried to be built around this in a way that was helpful. But the flip side of that is, trying to ask those groups to do that in a lightning fast way and to really get into the places that were not part of our known networks. There was real tension around that. And how do we think about this process of doing this work through our known networks versus an open process that would allow us to find these places very quickly? So that was the other thing. And then I just would say, I guess I would leave it there. It really, I think a lot of what happened in terms of what we were able to do for immigrant communities and particularly undocumented immigrants, thinking about cash assistance, thinking about this way of flexibility, it really did open the door for increased advocacy in Illinois. You saw a little bit of that, like the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights success in Alice's report. But we have other groups like Economic Security Illinois who are really pushing for a different kind of expansion of the earned income tax credit and who should get included so that policy level works for more people differently. That really can open the way for more of these more progressive policies to do things that we've been talking about for decades. And like, how do we continue to think about philanthropy's role? I could talk more about what Grant Victoria Foundation is doing, but we are funding several of the groups directly that were funded through the Illinois COVID Fund. And we're giving them general operating support, multi-year support, so that they can continue to kind of do the work that we started without this yo-yo effect of the funding to say build infrastructure and then dismantle it, build it, or whatnot. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Sharon. That's there's a lot there, and as Alice and Athea are dropping in the chat, there's some really good sort of case studies, both about Grand Victoria Fund, but also the work in Illinois to pick up from, and just a few things that that sort of prompted me in terms of what you were saying of both some of the challenges and the sort of opportunities that you all really tapped in, and this question of the inadequacies of public data, and also the reality that these efforts, this sort of community-based, even public-private, some private initiatives, the type of data that Dr. Eddy, that you were talking about in terms of knowing your community, but that we were getting actually as part of this these responses. I know so many organizations we worked with had a reach and a response from the constituency we've been working to reach far beyond what we were able to meet the demand, but the opportunity to engage them in other things. And I don't know if you all saw this, but there was I'll drop it, but the National Domestic Workers Alliance, one thing that they did as part of their response effort, they were using both the ALIA platform, but also other efforts to collect data in a confidential way that then filled in a lot of the gaps of the public data, particularly on the sort of domestic work, informal, particularly undocumented. And so how do we actually think about this as a, sort of the data that exists now, particularly around sort of the populations that we know get excluded and are lost from sort of public systems to help the solutions? And it just occurs to me that's something that is left to be done. I think it can be done sort of on a local or state level based easier, but what does that look like at this federal level where there's real opportunities for programs to meet the needs of these groups? The other thing that you just talked about, Sharon, that I think was really, you all did really well, and Dr. Eddy, I might come back to you because I know you worked closely with the city of Philadelphia, but the way in which, how do we use our philanthropic dollars wisely, right? To complement, to tap, and to catalyze what we know needs to be the larger dollars of public dollars to meet the need. And what does that actually mean? And how do you do that strategically and thoughtfully? And then finally, this question of how do we pool? And this report was really meant to do some of this. How do we have some centralization and some sharing of the insights, the tools, the approaches, the ways of doing this in one place? So it's not that, Sharon, I'm calling you and you're calling Kevin, and Dr. Eddy is calling the folks in New Orleans, et cetera, at the time of crisis. Like, we have to be able to flip the switch better. And I'll just call out, because she's on here, Ginny Goldman, who was a consultant working really closely with OSF in our efforts, who with Amalgamated Bank has seeded and started what they're calling Organizing Resilience Hub, as a way to try to be a bit of a hub of these types of learnings and tools that can flip the switch a little bit easier in these moments, particularly as we're going to be facing increasing economic disruption due to climate change. This is just going to become more and more of an issue. And so, Ginny, if you have any information you want to drop there, that would be great. So I don't, y'all are shy, and I know that there is a question here. So I'm going to take that one. And I'm also I know, Jenny Siegel, you are in the audience and did a lot of work in Boston working with folks there around this issue, or others from OSF. So please do feel free to pipe up. But I am going to take this question because Millie put it forward about what are the specific ways we can encourage philanthropy to adopt this trust-based approach. In not just crisis funding, but more broadly. And Alice and Althea, I'm going to give you the first swipe and see if anyone else wants either to respond to that question or other ones that were raised here as we sort of turn our last 5 minutes.
Well, I'll just say, as I echoed in the chat, that for sure, when funders start to partner in collaboratives, whether it's SURF or the Workers Relief Fund, the Relief Workers Fund, that they start to see new practices that are trust-based, and sometimes that helps influence their own foundation's work. So I'm a big fan of the collaboratives like the GCIR Delivering on the Dream Collaborative, where foundations really learn a different way. Alice?
I think the other thing is that people who are natural leaders in philanthropy need to uphold these practices and talk about why they make their grant making better. I think leaders have that influence.
So can I respond to that, Alice?
Please.
I think we are going to be a profoundly different foundation coming out of the COVID and the racial justice moment last year. And a lot of these things that we're talking about today, like, we are putting into place. We have a rapid response fund line item now in our grant making so that we can continue to do that. Like, for folks who have these similar things, these things come up all the time. We've heard this for a really long time. We've gotten that direct feedback from our partners. We're going to execute on that. And we started doing that. We are actually moving into 2022 as part of our what we'll release as a new strategy. We will be streamlining grant making applications. We will shift how the reporting happens. We're going to really focus on what it is we need versus what it is that we want, which was what we did during the pandemic, but it's something that people have been asking for a long, long time. So we are going to structure that into the way in which we work. We have started a participatory grant making program and kind of tested this idea of seeding the decision making on grants to folks in the local community that we fund. And we're thinking about like what are other ways to think about as we collect more information and research on other organizations and other things that exist in the state, how to take that into a more participatory approach into account so that we are centering the needs of other folks and not centering the needs of the foundation. So we will be profoundly different. We've been making these shifts already, and our board, for whom I'm grateful, that they really recognize the moment that we can actually be more transformative. We're trying to do a better job of like sharing this with our other colleagues so that, people don't continue to say, we don't know how to make these shifts. I think the biggest lesson that we got from COVID is we know exactly what to do, and we knew what to do, and we deployed these resources in the most quick way that I've seen in 16 years in philanthropy. So I'm very excited of the trajectory of us as an individual foundation and the potential for that to be inspiring for other people, and to be doing that much more differently in partnership and relationship with people like Eric's group. So
thank you.
Rah.
Thank you, Sharon. That you are inspiring me for sure. And I just think that these spaces to sort of really actually share both the sort of the strategic challenge, but the actually on the ground, how do you do this, perhaps in places that don't have you in their leadership or the board in the same way, I think will be very helpful. Dr. Eddy, I actually want to give you the last word, 2 minutes, on just any other things that you would want to put on the table to philanthropy about what we should be either sharing, readying, or sort of strengthening for the next time we are hit with this type of a challenge.
Thank you so much. I will say this, that I have seen it with other funders, and I think it is very helpful, especially for growing a small organization. It's the follow-up of a grant. It's not just, hey, here's we love your proposal, we fund you, we wait for the report, but what is the technical assistance that is provided? Earlier I talked about we're being more intentional about staff wellness. It is actually something that what I build the knowledge around based on the small funding that we had from a funder during this time, right? But the funding came also with quite a number of check-in meetings very regularly that allowed the funded groups and the funder to remain in a constant contact throughout the period of the grant. And I think the more that is done, the feedback will be greater, and then even the reporting period is going to be like just a continuation of the conversation that has been built in there. Two more things I want to share very quickly about the data. It is one of the things that what we also struggle with, because we're bigger and the larger organization, even city funded agencies. Anytime they collect data, they collect great data. Those data is not, the data is not that much disaggregated for us to know what is it that our communities will need. We had a small funding from the Skyler Good Foundation to try to do that as well. So funding can go in that direction to help those community-based organizations build their own capacity in terms of how do they track in a more efficient way the people that they serve. And those kind of data can also serve, right, to enlighten the work that we do. And then we can share that, of course, with the funders for their work. In terms of the public and private, I am one of those people who believe that, with my experience with the city of Philadelphia, and I tell you the way it is, accessing, what city funds is too opaque. It is too obscure. There's too much politics around that. So if a philanthropy does not want to get into that way, hey, will be good. If not, it's another layer of barriers that, we have to go through. Certain programs have worked very well, public-private partnership or partnership between, private funders here and also public, but it's too much.
So thank you so much. We just really appreciate this. Is so ripe and it's so ready for further conversation, and just really appreciate you all taking the time. Each one of you speakers, Alice, Althea, Eric, and Sharon, and for everyone participating. There are many philanthropic calls to action here for us to. I really do agree. I do think we saw philanthropy flex, and now we need to keep those muscles taut and build from them. And so I really look forward to being in it with you and continuing the conversation. I did drop a link to a next stage conversation for those who are interested in joining, that the Organizing Resilience and at Amalgamated Bank is holding. And so I hope you all might join, and we can continue not to start ourselves over and over again on this, but really building this collective practice to be better. And then finally, I just really want to appreciate GCIR for your partnership in this with us, with all of us here, but particularly for those of us at OSF, and to be a resource, but also a hub of organizing and building muscle together. So thank you so much for organizing this, and I look forward to the continued work with you all. Have a good afternoon.